Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of History Quest. I am your host Brian, and we got a great show in store for you this month. We've got a couple of stories, historic tales that happened right here in McLeod County. Plus we have your favorite segment, The Undeniable Truth. And also we have some museum news coming up, so stay tuned and we'll be right back. All right, so our first story is called The Great Scare at Kennedy's Grove. This happened in 1877 near Lake Addie. It's a story about a kid sitting up in a tree because something scared him, and it's a great story. I came across it at the archives at the library, so I hope you enjoy. Lake Addie, 1877. It was getting late in the night. Dusk had settled hours before, and aside from the purple, nebulous glow cast from the moon and stars, the sky was pitch black. Frank Huffman was only a boy. He sat tight in a tree, clinging to a limb as if his life depended on it. He was on a hill near Kennedy Grove, a little wooded knoll along Buffalo Creek. Below him, cattle grazed in the moonlight, cattle that the young man meant to herd up and drive home to the family farm. Fear would not allow the boy, however, to come down from the tree, as it was a great scare that sent him climbing up in the first place. It happened earlier in the evening, right around dusk. Frank lived with his family in a log cabin east of Lake Addie and west of Buffalo Creek. Though he was a young boy, he was tasked with herding and watching over not only his family's small herd, but that of the neighbors as well. He, and often his brothers, would herd the cattle together and walk them to Kennedy's Grove where the cattle could graze and where the boys could keep a lookout from the knoll. Frank wished for a pony, a tool to make herding and driving cattle easier. Yet, with horses scarce, he and his brother would have to herd on foot. On this evening, young Frank Huffman was watching over the cattle by himself. Around dusk, he began herding them together to start driving them back home. While trying to get a cow out of the brush, however, he spotted a large gray timber wolf coming his way. The wolf filled the boy with fear. By 1877, timber wolves had become scarce in central Minnesota, and Frank had never seen one before, but he'd heard the stories passed down from his father and others about the trouble the pioneers had with wolves killing livestock or stalking travelers on the trail. When the wolf came into view, Frank ran for the closest tree and climbed high for safety. The wolf disappeared shortly after being spotted, yet Frank feared that it would be back the minute he touched his feet to the ground. Hours passed before Frank climbed down from the tree, not until his father arrived at 10 p.m. to check on the boy. As Frank recounted the story, the elder Huffman was in disbelief, as it had been years since a wolf had been spotted in the region. He surmised that the wolf was likely somebody's pet dog, and that the boy's imagination had run wild with fear. 2 days later, however, a large gray wolf was spotted 2 miles up the creek from where Frank was. The boy received his pony shortly thereafter. The wolf wasn't Frank's only close call at Kennedy Grove. Another time, Frank was in the grove, again near dusk, when he spotted a large bear coming toward him. This time, the boy acted fast and grabbed his rifle. He laid the barrel across the pony's back and took careful aim. From the look of it, the bear straightened up and stood on its hind legs. Yet something didn't seem right, so Frank took a closer look before pulling the trigger. And it was lucky that he did. The bear was no Bruin at all, but rather a man named Harry Gliver, who was wearing a long, black, dog-skinned coat. Our next story is called The Sugar Moon. This is actually one of my favorites. I wrote this when I first started as director at the McLeod County Historical Society, and I read the story, fell in love with it, and so I wrote it, and here we go. Hope you enjoy. Elvin Higgins sat upright at the sound that startled him so much. From the cellar below the floorboards that his feet rested on was what sounded like a barrage of gunfire. To make matters even more puzzling, he could feel something hitting the underside of the floorboards. Of course, there was no one in the cellar firing a gun, yet Elvin and his wife, Viola, had no other immediate explanation as to the clamor happening in the basement of their Hutchinson home. It was fall of 1923, late fall to be exact. The weather that year had been dry. Scarcely did enough rain fall to keep the crops from failing. The river was so low it could run through a stovepipe. Trees were dying from the lack of moisture, and the well at Elvin's place was so low that he could only pump water for minutes at a time before it would run dry. It was one of the first in a string of dry years through the 1920s that would lead to the Great Dust Bowl in the decade to follow. While drought swept through the countryside, the city of Hutchinson was in an era of transition. The old dirt roads were being paved over with asphalt. A new water tank and a new well were being installed. 2 brick churches were being erected, and a Masonic temple was being built. The city, as well as most of America, was going out with the old and in with the new. Elvin, being Hutchinson's city engineer, played an important role in all of this. Though towns and cities across America were transitioning to the modern world, rural life remained much the same. Few, if any, farms had electricity, and almost no one in the country had indoor plumbing. For the most part, people living in rural Minnesota were living a life very similar to that of their ancestors, as was the case for Elvin and Viola Higgins. The fall harvest was completed. Though dry, Elvin and his son Charles raised a decent crop of oats and 40 acres of good corn, due in large part to planting in a dried-up marsh that held some moisture in the soil. As a bonus, one of his friends, Sam Anderson, had an ample crop of apples, for which Elvin took advantage. Historically, late fall has always been the time to harvest the apple crop. Trees are typically drooping from the weight of the bright red fruit, and the hard frosts turn the apples crisp and ripe with mouth-watering fruit juice. It's no wonder that Elvin and his workers gladly picked 15 bushels of sweet red apples. Viola got at the apples first, cooking them down and sealing them in fruit jars for the long winter ahead. Elvin, too, had a plan for his share of the apples, and like Viola, his plan had to do with the long winter ahead. Unlike Viola, Elvin's apples would have little to do with eating. The apples were pressed in a cider mill, and the juice collected in 4-gallon jugs. With 25 gallons of cider, Elvin brought them home and headed for the cellar. He thought that if he doused each gallon of cider with 4 pounds of sugar and then pounded the jugs shut with corks, his cider would ferment and have a little extra kick to it. With 25 gallons of what Elvin called sugar moon stowed away, Elvin could sit back and wait for the cider to brew. Bear in mind that this was 1923, and what Elvin was doing wasn't exactly legal. All was going well until the day that Elvin was startled by what sounded like gunfire in the cellar. He ran down quickly, only to see that his sugar moon was brewing so strong that the corks blew out and hit the underside of the floorboards. The liquid was boiling over the jugs in a mountain of foam. Though it made the basement smell like a brewery, Elvin pounded new corks into the jugs and went back upstairs. A couple hours later, and the sugar moon blew its top yet again. Elvin was not willing to give up on his homemade sugar moon, so he decided to recork the jugs, but this time to set boxes, weighted with stones on top of the jugs to keep the corks from blowing. This worked for a time, but eventually the sugar moon's kick was so strong that even the weight of stones could not subdue it. Over the next few days, Elvin did whatever he could to save the strong cider, but he could do little more to subdue its kick. At times it would blow its top so loudly that the neighbors could hear it, for which Elvin had excuses that the walls in his house were settling due to the dry conditions. Eventually, only a few jugs remained. In a last-ditch effort to save the brew, Elvin decided to get rid of the large jugs and pour the sugar moon into smaller containers, thinking less pressure would build. For a time it worked. Then one day, Elvin went down to the cellar to check up on his cider. He grasped one of the jugs in his hand and raised it to take a look. The motion was too much for the brew, however, and the entire jug blew up in his hand. Dripping with sugar moon, Elvin decided to extract the corks in an attempt to save the jugs. The first cork nearly took his head off. He tried to save the brew by placing his hand over the mouth of the geyser, but instead, it made the jug shoot out of his hand and break upon the floor. From that point on, Elvin was afraid to go anywhere near the jugs, and he just left them be. He never did get to taste his prized sugar moon, because in his dread to go anywhere near the jugs, the liquid inside eventually turned to vinegar.
In a world of fake news, where the facts are sometimes altered, we bring you the undeniable truth with Brian Haynes.
Hello, America. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon. I am your host, Brian Haynes, and we are here again for a segment of The Undeniable Truth. Of course, we call it that because in today's America, we no longer know what is true, what is fiction, what is nonfiction, what is made up, what is biography. We have no idea. But here on this show, with me as your host, you will only get the undeniable truth. First, some news from Washington. Stimulus talks are underway at the Capitol. Democrats and Republicans debate on the size, color, and shape of the table for which they will talk about stimulus relief. Once they have decided on the shape of the table, they will send it to the Senate, where they will vote on the color of the table and just how much money Uncle Joe is going to give us when he opens his wallet and hands us a shiny nickel or two. Oh, woe is we for the drudgery of the workaday world. Well, in the normal world anyway. Back when things were simpler, and the term coronavirus meant a night out drinking too much Mexican beer, the world was gripped with a phenomenon that took place every day when the clock struck 12. In many stores, businesses, construction sites, and offices, the lunch hour caused a near standstill where people dropped everything, came together, and socialized with one another at a table. Cafeterias all around the nation turned into activity centers, and people flocked to diners, cafes, and fast food restaurants simply to eat lunch, to grab a bite, and to talk with their neighbors. Sadly, coronavirus has put a halt on all of that. We now eat alone in our offices, in our closets, in our own kitchens. It's sad, it's lonely, and it's sad and lonely. However, things weren't always this way in terms of the lunch hour. Wellington Clay, a man who's turned out to be quite a resourceful friend, even though it's posthumous. He was a well-known writer for the Hutchinson Leader, and he once wrote a piece on how lunch, more specifically the lunch hour during the workday, was typically not practiced. Not practiced, especially in the formative years of McLeod County. From the time the settlers first laid roots into McLeod County to about the turn of the 20th century, the stoppage of work for a midday meal was very uncommon. Breakfasts in those days tended to be large. People would often fill themselves with hearty foods such as salt pork, bacon, sausage, eggs, pancakes, you name it. Butter, jam, coffee, all those good things that we like to eat. A household, anything they had on hand was considered breakfast food at that time. And in the words of my good friend Mr. Clay, the average businessman loaded up so much cargo that it kept him going throughout the day, and he didn't need to stop for lunch. Though restaurants were regular business types in each town, especially in the Midwestern towns, most were ill-equipped compared to their 20th century counterparts. Coffee was only served in the mornings, and except for in winter, of course, when soup was served all day long, the stoves were kept hot and coffee kept being boiled. In the summer, however, it was a different story. Once the breakfast hour was over, nobody drank coffee anymore. So they say. Though most restaurants did not typically serve a full meal at noon, That didn't mean people didn't get the urge to snack during the midday. Oftentimes, farmers had to travel over long distances to get into town, and they were sometimes hungry on arrival. Heck, I know I'm hungry after I travel a long distance. How about the rest of you? Yeah, everybody's hungry after you travel a long distance. I don't understand what's so strange about that, but here it is. During midday, saloons and sometimes restaurants offered what they called a lunch counter. It did never consist of an entire meal, though. It was typically cheese and crackers, maybe some sardines, maybe a little bit of summer sausage. Just enough to get you into the saloon to buy a beer to wash it all down with. The lunch was considered free. They just wanted you in there to buy the beer. Later on, however, as German and Scandinavian immigrants began coming into the towns and settlements in the region, they brought with them their own custom of a midday meal. Wellington Clay claimed that this is where lunch as we know it today originated. Around the dawn of the 20th century, businessmen began stopping in the middle of the day to eat or to have coffee with other business owners and friends. However, it was really more of a social aspect, a time to do business with other businessmen, versus just a time to stop and to eat your lunch. As the 20th century progressed and the lunch hour became more common, more establishments began serving a noon hour special. Soon, the Norman Rockwell image of the hungry businessman sitting around a lunch counter in a downtown diner became a regular sight in small towns across America. Today, though COVID has put a hold on the noon hour atmosphere, we can assuredly agree that once we are able again to congregate at a local diner with no mask and near one another, we will do so with enthusiasm and no longer take lunch as something for granted. There you have it, America. Lunch is the thing we take for granted, and that is an undeniable truth. Make sure you come back next month. We'll have a whole list of other undeniable truths for you in a world where sometimes the truth is hazy. All right, so that was our show for you this month. Like I said, we've got a little bit of museum news to share with you. First thing I'd like to tell you about is the book, Where the Big Woods Meet the Prairie, is finished. It is on sale at the museum right now. You can stop in during our open business hours and pick a book up. If you would prefer, we can mail you a book. Shipping and handling rates will be applied. Otherwise, you can also pay for the book, and we can deliver it to you on curbside if you're a little leery about going into a place because of COVID and everything. But the book has been finished. It's selling great, so I highly recommend coming down to the museum while we still have copies of the first printing left. Also, the barn that I've talked about in the past is finished, and we're setting it up right now. We are anticipating that by the end of March, we'll have our new edition all ready for you to come and see. So stay tuned, watching the leader, that's usually where these things get posted, as well as on our Facebook page or on our web page, and you'll have an official date coming up soon as to when the new edition will open up. I'd also like to share with you that we are resuming our monthly Breakfast Club meetings for members of the McLeod County Historical Society. We had kind of taken a little bit of a hiatus with it, just for the fact that COVID restrictions, and people were a little leery about coming on out. But now that the restrictions are being lifted and people are looking for something to do again, we have decided to resume our monthly Breakfast Club meetings in March. And remember now, this is always the fourth Monday of the month at 10:30 a.m. In March, we will be having a roundtable discussion, and the topic will be butchering on the farm. We always hear a lot, people like to talk about butchering on the farm, and honestly, I love hearing about it. So if you have some stories or just want to hear some of the stories, make sure you come down on March. Also in April, we'll be doing it, and again, this will be the fourth week in April, the fourth Monday at 10:30 a.m. Every month that we do this, it's always on the fourth Monday at 10:30 a.m. So, but at any rate, in April, our Breakfast Club will actually be a show and tell. Typically, we have a speaker or we have a roundtable discussion, and we thought maybe we'd do something different this month, for the month of April, that is. And we're going to be doing a show and tell. So if you have any kind of interesting artifact or story or anything from your history, your family history that you want to share or talk about, come on down on that fourth Monday in April, and please do share. Lastly, I'd like to share with you that the mural for our legacy wall is in the home stretch, and we plan to put it up over the next couple of weeks. There are also still some blocks left to purchase. If you need a refresher, the blocks are just a way to preserve your family's legacy or your farm's legacy. You can put the name of your farm or a family member, parent, grandparent, what have you, and their date of birth and their date of passing, or if it's a farm, the date when the farm began and the date when the farm ended, or if it's still going, you can say to the president or to 2021, however you want it. You get different color combinations for these blocks, and they all kind of have to do with different tractor colors, so you can put those colors on the block as well. And like I said, the block is just it's in our new edition on the block wall, and it's a way to preserve your legacy and the legacy of the county, really, with agriculture for many years to come. So if you're interested, make sure you call the museum for some more information, and we'll help you out there. But that's about all we have for you this month. So thanks for watching, and hopefully we'll see you again next month. All right, bye.